stumbling in English, so right. My way. What do I think about that? Well, if you want to be a teacher, doctor, engineer, or something else, some other mundane profession, usually go to a school or this school or that school or so, and then after you're finished, you try to get a job. Translators do it differently. They very often just stumble into the profession. I did. I had no idea what I wanted to do. Tried to get into the German school for one, and tried to be a teacher, substitute teacher for a couple of years. And then I found an ad looking for translators in a comic book epics. Woo! It was in the summer of 1985. So I sent in an application and got a test. The test was approved. So I started to translate comics. I'll go back to this page in a moment, but one of the comics that I did for about a year was the Foster Saga. It's a very strange British comic. It was sort of grew on me. It was all about tripe. Tripe is obviously a Scottish dish or something. I don't know exactly.
Oh, it's delicious.
If you can find the comic, look for it. It's great. But it takes a little getting used to.
Yeah.
Anyway, at about the same time, a friend of mine got a job as an editor at Target Games, a Swedish publisher of role-playing games and board games. And I was more or less headhunted for a job as an editor of the magazine. I think the main argument was, you're translating comics. That sounds cool. And you can spell. So, anyway, I started working at Target Games in 1986 and stayed on for 7 years until Target's finances sort of went up that way. During that time, I handled a lot of translations, editing other people's translations, wrote a whole bunch of text, translated a number of board games, and also started translating novels. The company had a book series of fantasy novels, and one of my first assignments was editing the translation of the first two Conan books by Robert Howard. I convinced the bosses that Terry Pratchett would be an excellent choice for a book series. I happened to introduce Pratchett in Swedish. I'll come back to that. After Target Games, I started on as a freelance translator in earnest, doing a lot of fantasy, a couple of books by Caffrey, Donaldson. If you've seen the Donaldson book, something to do with mirrors, it was published in Swedish and obviously didn't sell very much because the book was split up into 4 parts. Shows up everywhere. For example, in every IKEA store, when they're furnishing their bookshelves and make it look like somebody's home, you will find all these Donaldson books. Later on, we've done a lot of non-fiction books, anything from how to do a proper golf swing to tanks and fighter airplanes and stuff. Also translated the Philip Pullman books, his Dark Materials, into Swedish. In 2001, I lost my main supplier of assignments. Kahneman, a German publisher who wanted to go from number 5 to number 3 when they went to when they wanted to introduce themselves into the stock exchange. So they started publishing a lot of books lots and lots and lots of books, and forgot about the fact that you don't get paid for it until a long time later. So it sort of overreached each other. So I had to find something else to do, and started to look for translation agencies. I got a job, not as a translator, but as a graphic artist at one of those agencies, working on the first Greek IKEA catalogs, and putting the translation into the Cork Express files, because the owner of that agency found out that, Cork Express. Okay, you're hired. I've stayed around that company for the past 12 years, mostly as a freelancer, and later on, when I met my wife-to-be, she's sitting there. That was 10 years ago. I quickly dragged her into translation business. She's a language teacher originally, so that's her strange way into this. She married a translator, so now she's a translator herself. So, a little about myself there. So, let's go to requirements. What does it take to be a translator? Obviously, you have to know at least 2 languages. Your own and some foreign language, preferably a couple of them. There's a scale from 0 to 5, actually. 0 means you have no idea about the language. At level 1, you can order a beer, or perhaps ask for directions. At level 3, you know the language enough to be able to recognize the jokes and maybe have some sort of conversation. At level 4, you can actually tell a joke in that language. And level 5, you're what is called really absolutely fluent. People should be able to say that you're from some foreign country or something. You don't really actually know the language from inside out. So, to be a good translator, you should have your mother tongue, your target language at level 5. You can start translating actually from level 3 if you have a really simple text, but preferably level 4. Even better is if your foreign language is level 5 too, but that's really hard to reach. Cultural understanding is the next point. What do I mean by that? You have to know when there is a reference to something, to anything. Say somebody mentions talk show host, for example. You should recognize, just mentions the name. You should really know that, okay, this is a talk show host. How do I translate that? How do I explain that in my translation? Or knowing the little nuances of the language, or actually being able to recognize the style level of the source language and translating that into a proper style level in your translation. And to be able to move between text for children or text that is aimed at something that's perhaps aimed at someone who wants to do a more like I said, antiquated design, high level of formality in the text, or something written for teenagers. You have to be able to find all those levels and recognize them. Language studies, of course. Translation studies, well, that's health. We're looking at the two of us. I'm the one with long experience. I've studied English in the US. you can hear that somewhat. Carolina is the one with a nice looking CV with all of the language studies she's done, and also she has a translation studies course. What you do with it? The final question here is: do you have to be a walking dictionary? Of course not. No one knows every word there is in the language. Helps if you know quite a few of them. You have dictionaries for the rest, and things like Wikipedia, Google, whatever. You can always find out what you need to know. Carolina was once asked, for example, what's this called in French? It was some sports team. I don't know. How should I know? I don't play that sport. And I don't play golf. But I got this golf book assignment, and what I did before was to read a lot about golf. And sort of just swum around in golf texts to get a feel for the language they're using, how they're using the specific terms. So that's one of the things. Another requirement to be a good translator. You have to be able to pick up a set of phrases, a way of expressing yourself that is typical for a certain subject. How did it get started? Well, as I said, I stumbled into it. But if you want to be a translator, how do you get about it? Get the appropriate education, language studies, maybe a translation course. But there is this catch-22. You have to be able to show that you can do it before you get jobs. So how do you get the jobs? One way is doing asking to do the. When something needs to be translated from languages of Pakistan or Bangladesh or something, there are no translators can do it directly. So somebody has to do it into English first, because you can always find a Pashto English translator, but no Pashto Swedish translators. So we end up with a Pashto English and then English to Swedish. So if you have a strange language in your backpack, then we can get started easily. Good looking CV is always nice, especially if you want to apply for a job as a European Union translator. They always look at the CVs. Publishers, agencies, in-house. How do you work as a translator? Well, most of us are freelancers, work from our home. We either work for a publishing house, for example, or an agency. The difference between a publishing house and agencies is that the publishing house is the main commodity is translations. They sell translations. They sell translated books, translated movies and stuff. The agency is for all of those companies that sell something else, cars, furniture, whatever. And occasionally need something to be translated, a catalog, for example, or a sales brochure, or a manual. And they turn to the agencies. And both the agencies and publishing houses work about the same. They have their project managers and editors in-house and use a lot of freelance translators. Sometimes a company has so much translation work that they actually have in-house translators. IKEA does, for example, because they have the catalogs and everything and publishing in so many languages that they usually have in-house translators. A place like the Swedish Foreign Department has its own group of in-house translators also, because there's a lot of translation work needed to be done by a company like that. But for the unusual languages, they go to the agencies. Challenges. Anna talked about, when she introduced me, specific challenges of translations. So, what are they? You have to remember that there's a lot of different texts. Not everything is what you find in the tables out there, fiction. Lyrics and drama, for example, subtitling for movies and television, and non-fiction. They all require different things from the translator. You have to be able to translate fiction. You should really be able to. If you could be a writer yourself, yeah, you should do it. I could be a writer. I don't have any good ideas for stories, so that's why I'm not a writer. But the difference between a novel and a piece of lyrics, a poem, is enormous. You can't translate poetry like you translate novels. You have to get into the poem and try to figure out what does it say, what's the sense, what's the idea, what's the feeling, what's the atmosphere that the author is trying to convey. And then you have to interpret that. You're not translating poetry, you're interpreting it. That's one big difference. Subtitling. In Sweden, we're always subtitling movies and television. Some other countries don't. As very much television movies are original in English, a lot of Swedes have very loud opinions about subtitling because they can hear the difference, hear and see the difference between what is on subtitle and what is said. Then you have to remember that subtitling, okay, you have one or two lines of text, 33 to 36 characters. And a single line is up for 3 seconds, 2 lines are up for 5 seconds. And if you think about it, you can say a lot more on those 36 characters in 3 seconds. So you have to be able to cut down, concentrate. Perhaps change question and answer to a statement. And be very careful in what you put up there on the screen. Non-fiction. Well, usually you don't have to worry about getting into the writer's style as you do with fiction. But you still need to know something about the subject, or pretend that you know a lot about the subject by reading up on the subject before you start. Sometimes you realize that, okay, when you read translated non-fiction book, that I wonder where this person got his knowledge from, not from actually working on this. Well, sometimes you run into these really poorly translated books. Usually because the translator didn't know the subject at all. Working with translation, what do I use? Okay, a computer, obviously. When I started out in 1985, I didn't have a computer. I had never used a computer, so and the translations were for comic books, so I handwrote my translations. Got pages in the mail, and then wrote my translations and sent it in. And because somebody was going to hand letter the translations anyway, so computers weren't needed. What I'm using now, besides the computer, is the number of tools, CAT tools. Computer-aided translation is it's not a machine translation, but sort of a database that remembers what was translated before. So it breaks up the text up in segments. A segment is a sentence usually. So when I've translated my sentence, I save it it's just saved as a translation pair, translation unit. So when that sentence appears again, especially if you're translating things like catalogs and manuals and stuff, this stuff always comes back. Or if you're updating an old translation, it remembers these translations and the work goes on faster. Machine translation, well, you know about Google Translate and all of the other machine translation tools, and they can be extremely funny to play around with. I guess most of you have tried to watch your machine translate, Google Translate, or one of the others, and trying to switch text between different languages and see what you end up with. It's great fun. It's great fun. Especially if you take a simple sentence in one language, translate it, let it Google Translate it, take it to another language, and take that into third language, and fourth language, and fifth, and so and then go back to the original. Some really hilarious results. But machine translation is a very useful tool when used properly. For example, if you're looking at a page on the internet, in the language you don't understand, okay, let the machine translate it so you find out, is this something I should be concerned about? What is it? What is this about? Or like real life, real world example, when the United States invaded Iraq, they hold of tons and tons of documents, electronic documents, paper documents, and whatever, and they wanted to find out where did Saddam hide these weapons of mass destruction. Well, they couldn't find any anyway, but there were lots of documents to go through, and using machine translation, just run everything through the machine. Somebody could then look at the stuff and say, okay, this is not interesting, this is not interesting, okay, this one looks promising, and send that to a proper translator. So that's one way of using it, just sifting through tons of material. For me, as a translator, I use, of course, books on different subjects to get into the subject. I use Google a lot. Wikipedia is excellent. A lot of people criticize me with Wikipedia because there are so many wrong, so many faults and problems with it. So, but for example, I translated a book on astronomy a couple of years ago, and if I didn't know what a galaxy cluster is called in Swedish, I could look up the Wikipedia page. Okay, go down the sidebar and find the Swedish translation if there is one, and go to that page and get the Galaxy translation. And reading the Wikipedia page just to get a sense of what they're talking about. And then go back to the Swedish Wikipedia page, reading the same stuff. I get an immediate language crash course in that specific subject. That's extremely useful. What about shower? Occasionally you run into some really sticky problems. How to translate this, how to solve this, specifically when it comes to puns. I've found out that the best way of solving those problems is in the shower. I don't sing in the shower. I think about language problems. And a nice, hot, long shower is the perfect way. So just relaxing and get your mind flowing. So I'm going to talk about a couple of those specific challenges. Some cool examples. What should we do with Granny? Granny, the first Granny I ran into, in this case, was Granny Weatherwax. And her name is Esme Weatherwax. Weatherwax, and she's a witch. I noticed that obviously quite a few of you have read the Pratchett books. How many? Oh. Well, okay. Right. So, Granny Weatherwax. Whose granny is she?
Nobody.
None, actually. Turned out she doesn't have any children, and obviously no grandchildren, but still, the problem here is something a simple one. What's granny in Swedish? More or far more? Mother's mother or father's mother? So I have to choose. I do not have a word for just granny in Swedish. So it has to be either mormor Weatherwax or farmor Weatherwax. I couldn't decide. So when I was translating the book, I did one chapter at a time with farmor Weatherwax. The next chapter with mormor Weatherwax. Just to get a feeling for who is she. And for some reason, I settled with mormor. So it's mormor Weatherwax. Mother's mother. It could just as easily have been farmor Weatherwax. So, then we translated a book about Elvis Presley. And his grandmother was mentioned. Okay, whose grandmother? We couldn't just invent something. We had to figure out whose grandmother is it. So after some industrious Googling, we actually found the answer. I don't remember right now, but it was either mormor or farmor. If you find a book, you can look it up. So that's what to do with Granny. That's one of the problems. Talking about Pratchett, he's one of he was always very surprised that people even tried to translate his books. And he mentioned at one time the problem the Polish translator had, because death in Polish is a female entity. So I don't know what the Polish translator did with that. So there are a lot of differences. So I'm going to take the last piece here is a little more involved. It concerns part of the short description that is really inconsequential at the first level in which is abroad, not Pratchett. This is the second book where all three witches appear. The first one was Weird Sisters. The second one is Witches Abroad. And there's one of the things Pratchett himself said about translating his books is, if you can do something with a pun, do it. If you can't, just try to slide over it. Wasn't there. And if you find something in your own language that you can add some pun, please feel free to do it. So that's another thing with translating certain works. Sometimes you have a lot of freedom to adapt, sometimes you don't. Pratchett. Local people called it the Bear Mountain. This was because it was a bear mountain, not because it had a lot of bears on it. This caused a certain amount of profitable confusion, though. People often strode into the nearest village with heavy crossbows, traps and nets, and called haughtily for native guides to lead them to the bears. Since everyone locally was making quite a good living out of this, what would they say? Little guidebooks, maps, beer cakes, ornamental cuckoo clocks with bears on them, beer walking sticks and cakes baked in the shape of a bear. Somehow, no one had time to go and practice. Bad spelling. And then there was a footnote to this text. Bad spelling can be lethal. For example, the greedy serif of audibly was once cursed by a badly educated deity, and for some days everything he touched turned to blood. It happened to be the name of a small dwarf from a mountain community hundreds of miles away who found himself magically dragged to the earth and relentlessly duplicated. That phrase, relentlessly duplicated. Some 2,000 glods later, the spell wore off. These days, the people of audibly are renowned for being unusually short. Okay, Bear Mountain and Bear Mountain. Okay, this is a really funny joke. And it has another level though. Problem is, I can't do it directly into Swedish. It's impossible to do this particular joke and this pun in Swedish. So this would be a case where I would just slide over it and rewrite this text. So it's just, it's Bear Mountain, and there were no bears left, but people didn't know that, or whatever, something like that. But then I would lose the footnote, which is kind of quite funny in itself. If I lose the footnote, though, another problem would appear, because the dwarf is mentioned throughout the entire book. This particular book is a parody on fairy tales, so we're looking at whenever there is a gold or something or precious metal in, and Glod is there. Glod is the one who involved with the story of Rapunzel, for example, and there is Glod everywhere. So a whole large part of the book would have been lost, which would have been totally unacceptable. But as I said, cultural understanding, to be knowing a lot of the culture of everything comes from here. Because there is a second level to this joke. Is there anyone who has caught it? It's about, think about the scene. Witches, this is the introduction to the three witches having a Sabbath on top of this Bear Mountain. Music. Mussorgsky. Night on Bald Mountain. That piece of music is about the witch's Sabbath. Night on Bald Mountain, Bear Mountain. Those are synonyms. And that actually gave the solution to this problem, because that piece of music is translated and exists in Swedish, in Sweden too. But under the name Natten på Blå Kulla, Night on Blue Hill. And that gave me Blå Kulla as a name of the place. Blå Kulla is the place where witches go. Strange name in Swedish, because anything named hill would have been called Blåkullen instead. The Blue Hill. So Blåkulla is a strange name, and it associates with witches, but it can also be used as a word for kulla in itself, with a compound with dal. Dalkulla. Valley, Dalarna, kulla, I don't know exactly what that way of meaning of the word is actually, but it's a woman from the Dalarna province, it's a Dalkulla. So there's this misunderstanding can be working that the place is called Blåkullen for locals, because it's kind of bluish and it's just a hill. But people are missing this and think that they believe that it has to do with some blue painted women or something. So I did a translation working out of that. Actually, the idea of the realization of the second level came to me in the shower, by the way. So I've done a retranslation of the Swedish adaptation of this. We will see the importance of showers. Okay. Local people call it Blåkullen. Now you know what I mean. This was because the top of the mountain had all vegetation shaved off and therefore had a slightly bluish look. And because it wasn't particularly tall, as mountains go, not being more than a hill. A quite widespread misunderstanding said that the name of the mountain was Blåkulla, and that it had something to do with blue-painted women. This caused a certain amount of profitable confusion, though. People often strode into the nearest village and called haughtily for native guides to lead them to the strange women on the mountain. Since everyone local was making quite a good living out of this, what with a sale of maps, interestingly painted figurines, ornamental blue cuckoo clocks, etc., somehow no one had time to go and spell it. So, that was the solution to that one. How much time do I have left right now? What time is it? I don't know. I can check myself. Okay. Yeah. Questions?
It's actually true. Outside Oskarshamn, where I live, is an island called Blå Jungfrun. And some
the Blue Maiden.
some of the souvenirs are, we are looking at the mountain and a naked blue woman on.
That's his second enterprise.
So that's how you can sneak through a difficult problem. Just want to mention another. The first book of the with the witches, with all three witches, Nanny Ogg, Margaret Garlick, and Grant Weatherwax, was the Weird Sisters book, which is actually a parody of Macbeth, the witches, and Shakespearean English. And that gave me another problem, because Pratchett is contrasting Shakespearean English, which is quite a living language, sort of, because people are familiar with it, because plays are being played still, 400 years later, with modern English. And there's the Shakespearean Swedish, the translations are from the late 19th century. The difference between modern Swedish and Shakespeare Swedish is not that big. Very little, or very small. So, in order to deal with this, I had to exaggerate a couple of things. Exaggerate the modern Swedish of the witches when they break the spell of the you know the scene where the witches are brewing their spell in Macbeth. When shall we meet again? And so on, all of that stuff. This is the three witches are doing this, but they're breaking it off all the time with modern references. Eye of Newt. Is this really an Eye of Newt? Things like that. They're destroying, wrecking the scene. And so I had to exaggerate their wrecking of the scene, for example. And also use proper 16th, 17th century words for the fool when he's talking. I had to really exaggerate his use. So that would be sort of like making a sort of 16th century Shakespearean into the Swedish text. And there's actually one thing, yeah.
Can you tell what the misspelling in the headline stands for?
The importance of I think that happened when I just changed the headline from importance of showers to the importance of showers. I did late last night, wrote this late last night, so maybe excuse. Okay, shall we try to round it off now? Yeah. Okay, any more questions?
What do you do with Cockney?
What?
If you translate Cockney, is there?
If I translate Cockney, yeah, that's what Cockney in English is there's a very specific set of words and way of representing Cockney and some dialects. You can't do that in Swedish, because if I were to choose a different dialect, it would sound like I was trying to emulate Scanian or Valcarnian or something like that. So I would have to use, I can only suggest a lower way of speaking, lower style. Dropping the H's, for example. Some slang little things like that. It's a lot more subtle in Swedish, because I don't want to give the false impression that this guy is from somewhere else in Sweden. Yeah.
we have to round up here now, and because we have another speaker on. Thank you very much. I listened in, and I thought it was very interesting. We have an unconference part of this convention, like the last hour tomorrow. And if you would like to hear something more about, maybe you can sign up on that sheet, or have Olle do it, and you can form a group and have a further discussion about this. We'd like to thank you with a little bag.
Okay.
We've been sponsored by a Better Option bag, so it's completely ecological. You can bring it to you when you shop or when you have it in a...
Okay. Thank you.